It's the Yukon Podcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And Jeff, I'm just back from purifying myself in the waters of Lake Minnetonka on your orders, which was a strange but clarifying experience, but I don't understand what it means. What does it mean?
It means it's the 40th anniversary of the movie and album release of Prince's Purple Rain.
And in Purple Rain, Apollonia Cotero purifies herself in the waters of Lake Minnetonka on Prince's orders, except in a devastating plot twist, it turns out that's not Lake Minnetonka.
Not at all.
Yeah, so if you know what that all meant, you are clearly a, aficionado of Purple Rain, and you might like to hear our reflections on its 40th anniversary. If you don't know what any of that means, although I think it's pretty much a cultural meme, isn't it? The famous Lake Minnetonka incident.
Is it? I don't know.
I think so. Well, anyway, but if you don't know what that means, keep watching. You will find out. We should do a little bit of setup here, Jeff, because we have very different backgrounds on the Prince conundrum, the Prince question. And this will be astonishing to many people, had never heard most of the songs on Purple Rain, certainly had never seen the movie before you said, hey, it's the 40th anniversary, we should do a movie. So I'm we should do a video on the movie and the album. I'm very much a neophyte. I'm very new to this. You are, a long time
fan? So this comes out in the summer of 1984, 4 years ago.
You're in your mid-teens.
8 years old.
8 years old.
And the first Prince song that I can ever remember hearing was When Doves Cry, which was the lead single off of the album and was released about a month before the movie showed up in theaters. And it rocketed straight to number one. And it was the first time now Prince had, as we'll maybe talk about, he had other big hits before then, but this was the first time I remember hearing about and learning about Prince. And so I can remember the iconic music video with him riding the bespoke motorcycle, purple motorcycle, out in the forlorn fields of Minnesota somewhere. And, at that point, Prince became one of the biggest music superstars in American culture for sure, and would go on to stay that way for a good 5 or 6 years. So I have known about this musician and this music and for a very long time, and have been a considerably big fan for maybe 25 or 30 years since. You, I know, are steeped in the genre of Britpop.
Yes, I'm steeped in
and not a whole lot.
Guitar music from Manchester from about 1984 until maybe the late 1990s, although I only went that early because that encompasses the Smiths. Prince, not from Manchester.
No.
Not a part of Britpop.
Not Britpop at all, but I'm curious about your sort of awareness or
my awareness of
Prince as a figure.
So I'd never seen the movie. In fact, I didn't even know it was, there was a movie. I definitely heard Purple Rain just because it's so ubiquitous. And I could have sung you the chorus, but not the rest of it. And I hadn't kind of, sat with the song, or, maybe we will talk about how interesting a song that is. The rest of the songs on that album, I don't think I'd ever heard before. I'd probably heard When Doves Cry in the background of something, or, is it in Beverly Hills Cop? It sounds like it would be in Beverly Hills Cop.
It would.
It's very of that
It's been
era.
so long since I've seen Beverly Hills Cop, I can't remember.
It sounds, so maybe it was in a, it was on a soundtrack or something. I heard it that way. I hadn't heard any of the rest of the songs, which I know is just astonishing to people because it's widely considered one of the greatest albums of all time, and Prince a great sort of virtuoso, but not someone I'd ever listened to or connected with. So in many ways, this is a reaction for me. I've probably heard the songs 3 times, including the time I watched the movie now all the way through. So that's where I'm coming from. So in terms of knowledge and sort of mature reactions, as always, those are the preserver Professor Dude.
Yeah.
In terms of kind of off the top of my head, uninformed nonsense, as always, I'm your man. So we should get into it. We have a 3-part structure by which we address these texts. And we really have 2... Are they 2 separate texts? Purple Rain, the album, and Purple Rain, the movie?
They certainly work in concert with each other.
Yeah.
And by
Pun
design.
intended.
Pun intended. By design. And I think it's easier to consider... I think it is possible to consider them as separate products.
Yeah.
But they're so deeply intertwined as well that we wouldn't want to think of them as radically opposed or disconsonant.
Yeah,
products.
I mean, my hot take, and stay tuned to see this paid off. My hot take is, absent the album, the movie is career-endingly bad. I mean, it's just a stone cold. Yeah. I'm sorry, Mr. Rogers Nelson. You will not be working in the film industry going forward.
The movie as a movie is catastrophic.
Yeah,
and awful.
But it manages to combine. It's career-endingly bad in two ways. One of which is funnier than the other. I mean, the first career-endingly bad way is it combines. What's that guy called who made that? Was it called The Room? You know, the guy who famously, that lunatic who shot and acted in and produced his own movie. And it's like widely considered the worst movie ever made. I think it's called The Room. And I'm blocking on the guy's name. But it's, you know, it's just a disaster class. And elements of the movie really, you know, surreal non sequiturs, appalling acting, you know, and that's the way in which it's sort of funny, in a way. The way in which I think it would be career-endingly bad, especially, you know, nowadays. I know that's a cliche. It's just the rampant misogyny, just the, you know, not only attitudinally, but the actual physical violence, just sort of routinely inflicted and on women, and accepted as, oh, that's just what happens in a healthily tempestuous budding romance. Of course, you would hit someone, and then that would show them your passion, and you know, I think that would be the end of the road.
Yeah, it's a transparently misogynistic movie for sure. The acting is, with the exception of Morris Day, who is a kind of a natural on screen, the acting is horrendous. The dialogue is worse. The story itself is so full of plot holes that you could catalog. We could spend the next hour cataloging all the plot holes. As a movie, it's not good.
Yeah.
However, about half of what we see on screen are these transformative, electric concert performances, mostly from Prince and the Revolution, but also some incredible performances from Morris Day and the time.
Agreed.
And it's unclear. I think that we can just focus on the concert scenes. And the movie has great validity because of those scenes and because of those performances. And we can choose to cabin off the movie qua movie elements.
So I think in context, though, you know, out of context, as I say, it's career-endingly bad for the reasons that we talked about. In context, and if you're willing, and many people quite rightly would not be willing to do this, but if you're willing to consider the wider context, it's a very interesting text, even I think as a movie. And so I don't want to cabin it off, and I don't want to, you know, I'm not rejecting the thing out of hand. It just requires. You know, it's not only elevated by the music, but sort of only exists as a viable artistic concern because of the music and because of the wider context and symbology of Prince. You know, where the movie is doing catastrophically regressive things in one sense, but is doing actually very progressive things in other senses. And it's you know, for people who know the movie and are maybe steeped in some of the scholarship on Prince, they know what I'm talking about. I think we probably do need to unpack it, though, because it's maybe a problematic thing to say, you know, without that unpacking. Anyway, we have a three-part framework by which we address these texts. We first look at the text on the surface, which involves, in something like a movie, looking at the plot in terms of music, looking at the lyrics, basically looking at kind of the authorial imprint and authorial intent. What is the thing saying on the surface? We then move to consider what we call the mythologies that are underpinning the movie or the text, or the social meaning structures. What is it that audiences, plural, might bring to the text that would help them decode and unpack it? And with something that's 40 years old, you know, something like misogyny or something like gender relations is a societal mythology that will have changed over those 40 years, you know, and I think it would be a very different movie if made today.
For sure.
And then finally we talk about critique, where we ask, is the piece of work offering an alternate vision of life? And sometimes we also ask, you know, how was it received by critics and learned observers and so forth?
Yeah.
Should we jump into it?
Let's go.
Okay, we will be right back. And we are back with our examination of Purple Rain, the movie and the album, on the occasion of its 40th anniversary. This is our segment that we call On the Surface. And Jeff, I think you wanted to talk by situating Purple Rain in the sort of arc of Prince's career.
Yeah, I think it might be tempting in retrospect to imagine Purple Rain as Prince's foray or big stepping out, big coming out party as a music star. In fact, this is his 6th album, right? So he has a considerable recording catalog.
I realized it was 6. I thought you were going to say 2nd or 3rd.
No, it's his 6th album at this point. And the previous album, 1999, was a big hit. It features 3 really big hits, the titular 1999, Little Red Corvette, and Delirious. These were big hits. So Prince is a big star already. But what he was not was this culture-defining superstar. He had not reached the level of his most famous rival, Michael Jackson, at that point. And so Purple Rain was self-consciously designed by Prince to be the big kind of introduction to a mass audience. And the way that he imagined doing that was by insisting that Warner Brothers fund a movie starring Prince, with Prince's creative vision, in order, as a condition for re-upping his recording contract with Warner Brothers. As the stories go, there was considerable hesitation on the part of Warner Brothers executives.
What could we have been worried about?
Because what Prince was proposing was a much older vehicle for music stardom. Purple Rain is a part of this long line of movies that feature pop music stars. And most famously, I mean, it really starts with Elvis in this sort of raft of movies that Elvis does in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. But it also is the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, for example, Yellow Submarine. And while those movies were pretty popular in their time, by the mid-1980s, this was a genre, the kind of the music pop star-driven movie vehicle that had really not had much success in recent years. The movies that starred the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton, the Beatles movie of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, was a kind of infamous bomb in the mid to late 1970s. And so this was it was a kind of time out of mind vehicle for introducing oneself to a mass audience. And so Warner Brothers was deeply reluctant to do it, but they also knew that they had this guy who had just had a huge hit with 1999, and they didn't want to lose him. Yeah. And so they reluctantly agreed to fund this movie. And Prince, as I say, designs this movie self-consciously as his entree into a mass audience. And we'll talk a bit in the next section about how the choice of genre here is important for all of this. But that's the backstory. And the story it's not entirely written by Prince, but it is heavily influenced by Prince's input and creative vision.
Well, it's sort of semi-autobiographical.
Loosely
right?
Semi-autobiographical.
Like the thing with, and I don't, my level of knowledge on this is not very deep. So correct me or forgive me if there's any sort of misinformation here. But my understanding is that Prince himself was had like a difficult home life and left home very early and kind of bounced around, and his parents had trouble as well.
His parents are both musicians, which is similar to what we see in the movie. There's some sense that there was a kind of a tumultuous home situation, although I don't know.
I don't know if it was exactly the same as the one.
Yeah, and I don't think it was exactly the same. It's hard to know. He was not an only child, right? In the movie, he's very, very clearly portrayed as an only child. That he has at least one sibling in real life. But the other way in which it's semi-autobiographical is the whole thing takes place in Minneapolis.
Yes.
Which is, Prince is famously from Minneapolis, and he stayed in Minneapolis his whole life. He, unlike really the vast majority of big stars who move to the coasts and move to L.A. or they move to Hollywood or New York City or wherever, Prince had zero interest, as far as anybody can tell, in ever stepping foot outside of the city limits of Minneapolis.
But I've learned from this movie that, in fact, the way that one succeeds in the music business is one does in fact move to Minneapolis, preferably from other cultural meccas famous for music. And in fact, one's path to superstardom is you find this one club. Yeah, and you sort of battle your way onto the roster of kind of night bands. And if you do that, despite there being, you know, in the movie, no one from any sort, no A&R person there or any sort of scouting or any, you know, but if you do a really good set and the crowd goes especially wild, you have then made it.
You've made it, and you'll be invited back.
Yeah.
And you can apparently play as many or as few songs as you want.
Yes, you play one song and walk off, and everyone's happy with it. And yeah, exactly. Or new songs every night if you like. Yeah, exactly. That's now my understanding of the music business. I mean, of course, what's going on here, and this is why I didn't want to abandon discussion of the movie completely, which is I do think it serves a sort of surrealist, maybe also almost psychoanalytic function as being Prince's utopia.
Yeah.
Right? Like Prince's utopia is that club. And is, you know, a Minneapolis that's a really vibrant kind of cultural scene. And his vision of making it is you make it in the club.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing.
Yeah,
and his whole world is kind of, you know, takes place in the kind of 10 miles around the club, but mostly actually at night in the club. That's when you're really alive.
That's right. Those are really good points. It's a vision of creation for the sake of creation.
Yeah.
And this is a consistent theme in Prince's life outside of the movie. I mean, he had very famously had significant later squabbles with Warner Brothers over the ownership and distribution of his catalog. Warner Brothers refused to release music on the schedule, the extremely elevated and advanced pace that Prince insisted on releasing them, because they had commercial concerns. They didn't want to oversaturate the market. Right. And Prince interpreted this as a stifling kind of cap on his creativity, which led to him abandoning his name Prince for a while, which led to a whole series of kind of very antagonistic relationships between Prince and anything that smacked of commerciality in the music industry for a while, including a refusal to have a web space. Because he saw this again as a kind of a perversion or a corruption of the purity of his creative vision. It's also interesting for you to note that it's Purple Rain is this kind of imagined utopia for Prince, because he also almost never wanted to leave that 10-mile space. He famously created this, it's not even a mansion, it was kind of a compound / recording studio / live entertainment space called Paisley Park, in which he spent almost all of his time. And as far as anybody can tell, he had no hobbies. He spent almost all of his time either recording, writing, or performing music. And he had it set up so that he never had to leave his home.
Yeah. Well, I lived in very close actually to Minneapolis for a year. And I never wanted to leave my home either, especially in the winter, because to walk the 15 minutes to teach my class, I was told on my first day, if you don't like wear a hat, you'll lose your ears to frostbite during the January semester. So I should. You
understand completely.
I understand completely Prince's view on never wanting to leave one's home whilst living in the state of Minnesota. So great, excellent. In terms of the plot of this thing, we should talk a little bit, or orient people at least a little bit towards the plot of the movie. Prince plays a sort of rebel, a James Dean rebel.
Yes,
is that reasonable?
Yeah,
a James Dean type rebel. Trying to tools around on a motorbike. Maybe that's where I got that from. Trying to make it. That's a fairly classic American story.
It is,
I think. There's a love triangle element to the plot. A new dancer, Apollonia, comes into town. I got Showgirls vibes at that point. Maybe that's another maybe reference point for the movie as career ending potentially, that that hovers in the background. And she, Prince falls for her, and so does Prince's great rival, Morris Day. And Morris Day is, in fact, Prince's collaborator in real life. Prince's kind of collaborator, but also someone who's one of these great beneficiaries of Prince's sort of boundless creativity. Yes. I mean, I don't want to slander Morris Day here, but my understanding is Morris Day performs Prince's music.
Right.
But in his independent,
are written by Prince. The same with the Vanity Six group, which then became the Apollonia Six for the movie.
Yeah.
Famously because Vanity herself refused to perform Several of the scenes, including the Lake Minnetonka scene, and so they had
it passed up on the strongest song of the whole soundtrack, right?
Apparently, did not want to sing "Sex Shooter,"
which is just I'm still trying to like comprehend the imagery or the literality of I'm a sex shooter.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I can't quite wrap my head about it. Yeah, you just need to. Clearly, there is a diagram. I mean, I don't know. But there's a love triangle between Apollonia, Morris Day, and Prince, which is, I mean, poor Apollonia, because I think Morris Day is a horrendous individual in the movie, and Prince is not that much.
Not much better.
Better, I don't think. And the movie is and then there's further rivalry. It's not just a love rivalry, but it's sort of a professional rivalry between Morris Day's band and Prince and the Revolution, where they're fighting over who retains the billing on the club's roster. And the sort of triumphant finale, which is a great finale, and also the last three songs in the movie are the last three songs on the album
in a slightly different order.
Yeah, but I think in both contexts they really work well as a sort of triplet, and they really build on one another, and they sort of combine well, but are also surprising combinations in ways that are really interesting. And in both textual contexts, that's a sort of killer ending, I think. And so that's the plot. Anything else we want to say on that side of things?
No, it's also the story. It's not just the kind of classic American success story. Although, I mean, it is meaningful to note, as we alluded to earlier, that unlike the classic American success story, this is not one that has at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, material gain, material benefit. Yeah. This is not the person in poverty rising to the level of financial success. Success here means something very different.
It's like as a realization of the or recognition from a crowd that is small but significant to the artist of the artist's mastery.
And the other way,
and winning the girl.
Yeah. The other way in which it's
also the plot of Karate
a little
Kid,
bit
as I remember.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, the one thing that's a little different than the classic kind of American success story here is that while the classic American success story fixates so clearly and closely upon the individual rise and the revelation of sort of hidden strengths and capacities and pluck within that individual, here the story is one that requires a community to bring out one's authentic and best self. And so there is a little bit of a break from that kind of classic tale of American individualism. I mean, here, Prince is really only able to become is only really able to become his best, most authentic, and truest creative self in collaboration with his peers.
Yes.
It's very important, I think, for the sense of the movie that the critical performance is the performance of Purple Rain, which, as we know, is a song that's written by Wendy and Lisa. At least the music is written by Wendy and Lisa. Up until that point in the movie, Prince considers himself and is considered by everyone else to be this kind of singular genius. He writes everything himself. He does not perform other people's songs, and he certainly doesn't co-write with anybody. And so it's in that moment where Prince becomes his truest, most authentic self, best able to deal with the kind of personal family trauma that has been reverberating throughout the movie and which has just reached a crescendo in his father's attempted suicide. It's there in that moment of concert, of togetherness, of community, bowling of community, both with the band and with the audience, that seems to be the critical hinge in the movie. And that is a little different than this kind of classic American individualist success story.
Yeah. That's a very important point. Okay, good. I think we should leave it there for On the Surface.
Yes.
And we should be back in just a second with our discussion of mythologies. And we're back with a continuation of our discussion of Prince's Purple Rain on its 40th anniversary. We wanted to talk in this section about mythologies. These are kind of societal meaning constructs that audiences might bring to the text, the movie, and the album in order to understand them. Prince is someone who, for whom this is a very important category, I think. And I wanted to start with a quote that we actually found in an article by Jack Hamilton in the journal Black Camera. We'll link to that in the description. Really, really useful, interesting article on Purple Rain specifically and Prince more generally and kind of what he meant. And Hamilton himself quotes other Prince scholars, Stan Hawkins and Sarah Niblock, and they say that, quote, Prince is in effect a set of shifting signifiers of music, ethnicity, and gender that permits an active reading of him, opening up many sites of identification and rapport for fans and scholars. What do you think it means to be a set of shifting signifiers of music, ethnicity, and gender?
Yeah, I read that as, or what that calls to mind for me is Prince is a deeply hybrid character. The music is hybridic. The presentation of self is as well. There's a kind of unwillingness to allow for the possibility of conventional definition. Conventional categories of identity seem to send Prince, both in his personal life and in his musical creative life, they seem to send him in crisis. He's completely disinterested in those things, which is why you can get the kinds of radically different sorts of, we might call them eras, so to speak, that we see in Prince's music. He can release an album that is heavily R&B, almost even disco early in his career. He can release an album later in his career that is full-on funk. And he can then have these albums around the middle of his career, like 1999 and Purple Rain and later Sign of the Times, which are significantly rock and roll influenced, and they all sound identifiably Prince. There is no contradiction. He could weave himself in and out creatively and musically within the same song, sometimes within the same stanza, with a whole variety of different genres. And there's never a moment at which you get the sense that he feels out of control, that he feels like he's doing anything that's unusual. And this is somebody who is deeply disinterested in conventional categories of genre and identity. And he sees them, it seems to me, as kind of playthings with which to traverse and not to be confined by. And so when I think about that quote of, he's a kind of an open signifier or a floating signifier for a whole variety of fluid types of meanings, that's what calls to mind for me. It's both musical and it's personal, and we see that just in Purple Rain. I mean, look at the attire that we see in Purple Rain. Sometimes he's shown topless, right, wearing hot pants or something. Other times he's shown wearing a tank top, very kind of conventionally masculine sort of attire. At other points he's shown wearing these elaborate, bespoke outfits that feature lots of violets, as the song goes, violets, and hues of purple and pink and different shades that are definitely not conventional masculine shades. Just the color purple itself, right, which is obviously the sort of through line of the entire set of projects. Purple is this kind of color that is itself hybridic, right? And so it seems to me that there is this kind of fluidity that the scholars are correct to note, and it crosses gender lines, and it crosses race lines, and it crosses genre lines. It's both personal and it's creative, and it's capaciousness.
Yeah, and although as you were speaking, and particularly talking about the color purple, purple is famously it's sort of a power color. Like it's a color that signifies dominance.
Which is why this is probably why you have the pocket squares that are purple.
I have lots of purple things. I do, and I wasn't realizing that I was following Prince, but I did. Yes, I am a sufficiently insecure individual that I Google what are power colors and then try and wear them to see if I can kind of hoodwink those around me. It doesn't work for me, but I think it does work for Prince. And what I was trying to, I find Prince a little bit confusing, and all of this could be just because I'm just one person with my own kind of positionality and my own sort of necessarily impoverished understandings of things like gender signifiers and so on and so forth. But there is a way in which you could describe, absent the experience of Prince, the way that he dresses, high heels and frilly shirts. You could look at his physical stature. He's very diminutive. And you could see that kind of playing with traditional masculinity as signifying a femininity or even, and sometimes, and maybe especially in the 80s, that might be perceived as sort of effeteness.
Yep. And frequently it was.
Yeah, but Prince is a dominant, thrusting, and I use those words advisedly, man, right? And why I say purple is a power color is that there is no sense that this is a retiring, effete individual at all. And in fact, he's thrustingly sort of, he's thrustingly heterosexual, not to equate in any way homosexuality with weakness, but there's no hint of him being anything other than, sort of very sexual and definitely heterosexual. I mean, I don't actually know his personal history. In a sense, it's not hugely relevant to the way he signifies.
Yeah.
But that's what's going on. And the reason why I find him a little confusing is I find all of that very attractive and very interesting and very progressive. But it clashes in the film with something we talked about in the first section, which is this kind of rampant misogyny. And it seems very difficult. It is a little difficult for me to understand how you can have a man who is doing the very interesting thing of taking a set of what might be seen as signifiers of effeteness and making them very thrustingly masculine and doing all sorts of, contradictory or subversive or interesting things there. And in the same context or in the same text, it is buying into and replicating some of the most horrendous stereotypes of a toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Where Apollonia is, and Apollonia in one sense she's kind of idealized and she's the great love and she's a great love interest and she's portrayed as an extremely talented person. And again, in the same text, she's totally kind of, she's made to strip for gratuitous reasons. She's hid in the face. She's thrown in a trash can. At some point, she's very knowing and agentic. And at other points, she's kind of drunk with Morris Day for reasons that are completely mysterious. And I don't think that character would put herself in that position. Yeah. And the whole thing just seems really confusing to me, Jeff.
Yeah, I agree.
And that was a very long monologue that shows my kind of confusion.
I agree. The transparent misogyny of the movie, on one hand, as you alluded to earlier, is meant to be played for laughs. And so I think part of this is that the idea was that some segment of an audience in 1984 would have laughed at Morris Day and Jerome throwing a jilted lover of Morris's and literally throwing her in the garbage. And that, as you alluded to, that there may have been some sense in which, domestic abuse was understood to be a signal of some kind of tempestuous love, a kind of a love-hate thing or something, and a reflection of passion rather than just violent abuse. And so some of that, I guess, is by design and is meant to appeal to audiences, given the sensibilities of the age. But you're right that it grates harshly against the kind of imagery that Prince portrays otherwise both in the music and in his appearance. And it's also notable here that Prince was constantly writing songs for female artists. Yeah, he in fact adopted an entire feminine persona later in his career called Camille, that he would sing some of his better known songs actually are him singing in this extremely high pitched voice. That he then used some studio trickery to kind of make even higher. There's all of that. And then there's this kind of, it's almost as though it's a resort to this kind of humiliation of actual women in order to both burnish his still masculine credentials, but also it's somehow to make it okay somehow to ease that maybe a felt anxiety that nevertheless still exists about his masculinity. Yeah. And it's hard to know. There's not a lot of evidence that the kinds of relationships that we see Prince engaging in, particularly with Apollonia and Purple Rain, there's not a lot of evidence, as far as I can tell, that this is how he actually treated women in his personal life or otherwise.
Yeah.
In fact, as we talk about creatively, it's exactly the opposite.
Right.
Prince's bands were always integrated along lines of gender and race. We see it in Purple Rain with the prominent role that Wendy and Lisa play. They were really important members of his band at the time of the Revolution. Later, the new band that he forms for the Sign of the Times tour features Sheila E. On drums, and Sheila E. was a powerhouse drummer. And really throughout his career, he was always working pretty closely with female collaborators. And there's, as I say, he was married a couple of times, but there's little evidence that he was physically abusive to any women.
Yeah. Well, and this is so maybe it's my impoverished or unsophisticated or inability to draw the fully sophisticated conclusion from a movie that at times plays itself off as autobiographical.
Yeah.
And at other times, he's called the kid in the movie, right? He's not called Prince, right? So he's it's that double move of simultaneously saying this is me and this is not me. And maybe I just haven't quite,
No, I think it's right to be confused about that. It's unclear. And maybe this is the nature of semi-autobiographical kinds of works like this.
Yeah.
One thing we can be quite certain of is that the real Prince does exist in the movie. It's in the concert performances.
Yes, yeah.
That for sure is the real Prince. Outside of that, it's hard to know.
Yeah. I'm not a woman, I'm not a man. I'm something you'll never understand. I'm not a lover, I'm not a friend. I'm something you'll never comprehend. Which song is that? Is that I Would Die For You?
I Would Die For You.
So that one's lyrically interesting because as I understand it, that's a song. When I first heard those lyrics, I thought, okay, this is about Prince's shifting signifiers, right? There's the gender fluidity in there. There's the not a lover, not a friend. I mean, those are lines that repeat in the movies and in other Prince's songs, and it gets to that interesting Prince double move of, what did you say? Sexy but not dirty.
Sexy but not dirty is the club owner in.
Oh, that's a line from the movie.
Make it sexy but not dirty.
Yeah, which is really interesting because in one sense, like sex suffuses all of Prince, and in another sense, it's a sort of sexless. You can't actually imagine. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure I want to go down this rabbit hole.
It's also a bit of a wink in the nod because sometimes Prince's songs are really dirty.
Yes,
they're not sexy; they're just dirty, right? Which we might talk about in the next section.
Yeah. But anyway, where I was going with that was when I did more digging into like "I Would Die For You." Isn't that song actually about Jesus? Prince was as I understand it, a pretty
hardcore Christian at that time in his life. And Let's Go Crazy is actually that is in fact, as he claims, that is a religious song.
Yeah, and there's backmasking on one of the songs. It might be the end of When Doves Cry or something else, where there's something about like don't worry because he will come soon. He is coming, and it's this very sort of gospel-y.
Well, and later on, Sign of the Times, there's a song called The Cross that is very explicit.
Yeah. So again, very interesting. Maybe what we're coming across here is actually the sophistication of Prince's signification that, I'm not a woman, I'm not a man, I'm something you'll never understand. Would be equally true in the religious context that song might mean, but also applies to some of the kind of gender fluidity.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Okay, good. So in terms of kind of the sort of gender mythology, is there anything else you want to say on that?
No, just that, and I think we'll probably get into this. It's worth remembering just how unusual of a character Prince would have been. Yeah. How unusual all of this was in the early to mid 1980s.
Yeah.
These days, 40 years on, it's maybe not that unfamiliar anymore to have big stars and kind of big cultural conversations about gender fluidity or about the ambivalence of different conventional identity categories. But for the early to mid 1980s, this is really unusual and subversive kinds of stuff.
Look, thank you for bringing that up because I think that is absolutely crucial. It's something that if you haven't studied that period or weren't alive during that period will seem absolutely baffling, and it's probably important context for our comments as well. And it's when you think about other artists during that period of time who were doing something other than hetero thrusting male rock. So there's Morrissey in England, who is also playing with all sorts of signifiers, but some of them are gender signifiers. Morrissey took the opposite. Where Prince embraced kind of being sexy, Morrissey embraced asexuality, right? This was his. He said, "I'm celibate. This is just not something that interests me," and that was the kind of permission structure to play with gender signifiers without it being essentially a career-ending thing. Now, two artists who it turns out were in the closet, George Michael and Elton John, were in imperial phases at this point and were absolutely the top of the charts. They could not have themselves perceived as anything other than hell-raising hetero men, or it would have been, or the sense was that would have been the end of mainstream chart success. Yeah. So what Prince was doing was actually, maybe does have to be seen in that context, and maybe some of the nods, I don't think this forgives it, but maybe it contextualizes it, but some of the nods to misogyny in Purple Rain might actually have to be viewed in that context.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. The other thing that comes to mind is that the genre choice here is also really important for Purple Rain. There are definite elements of rock and roll in all of Prince's earlier albums. As I say, as we talked about earlier, this is his sixth album. Particularly the previous album, 1999, I mean, one of the biggest hits is Little Red Corvette, which is a full-on guitar rocker. So he had certainly played in this genre before, but Purple Rain is the first time when you get a full album that is as heavy on rock guitar as it is. And there's something about the way, the iconography that particular instrument, the electric guitar, had developed over the course of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s that marked it, and we'll talk about this in a moment, that marked it both in a particular racial way, but it strikes me also it really made it a particular kind of set of gender significations as well. Now, there have been great female guitar players in the rock world and otherwise, I mean, from the beginning. But without a doubt, the instrument itself, electric guitar, had absolutely become understood as a kind of phallic kind of instrument, one that was loud and aggressive and assertive. And so there's something about the choice of spotlighting these songs that are so heavily electric guitar based that offsets perhaps any viewer discomfort with the more feminine elements of Prince's self-presentation, because it's difficult to reconcile, the loud, flashy, elegiac runs that he's performing on the guitar, electric guitar. It's difficult to see that as anything more than in-your-face, assertive, aggressive, and what would have absolutely come across at the time as very masculine in character.
Yeah. This is not, for a folk singer with an acoustic guitar singing about the paving paradise and putting up a parking lot, right?
Come on.
It is. I mean, when you were talking about it was me who was talking about phallus that night, as usual. But
he uses that at times. It's very phallic. He uses the guitar.
And I was going to say at the end of the movie, what do you think he's trying to say when he holds his guitar aloft and water comes shooting out the end?
Okay, so I was just going to say, so those guitars, it turns out, I was doing some research, were custom made. He had a luthier custom made this.
Oh, that's not off the shelf. Your telly doesn't do that.
There were apparently three of them, and they shot out water, and the designer, the luthier, took to calling them the ejaculators.
Perfect.
Or rather, I should say the ejacucasters.
Yes.
After the Telecasters.
But that was an idea that was later borrowed by Mad Max, I think. On those, they tool around. You've seen that with the electric sand, flames come out the top of it in the Mad Max thing. But that perfectly summarizes what we've been talking about. Man in frilly shirt with electric guitar, ejaculating all over the audience, and it does make you wonder, like, to what degree is Prince kind of sending things up here? He's definitely doing very interesting things that he's in control of as a capital letters important artistic project, but you do wonder at what point he's kind of sending things up or making fun. And even I did read one quote unquote defense of the misogyny in the film, which is it is so outrageous and so unaligned with the rest of his persona that is it actually meant to stick out like a sore thumb, and that becomes a sort of auto critique of that viewpoint. I mean, maybe that's letting it off too light.
Maybe it's possible, but then again, we always get into the problem of it's only parodic if your audience understands it as.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to talk a little bit about, as a societal meaning structure, race, how it intersects with genre, and in particular the rock star? I mean, when you were talking about I couldn't help but notice when you were talking about other artists who'd done these kind of movies, that were part concert and part narrative, the Beatles, Elvis, the Bee Gees, they were all white artists.
Yep.
I mean, is that a significant line of analysis here?
Yeah, and this is something that you were talking earlier about that Jack Hamilton article that we really both found to be quite illuminating. And this is one of the points that he really leans hard into, that Purple Rain, both as a movie and as an album, is a self-consciously rock and roll album rather than a kind of R&B/disco album. And it's really important here to note the ways in which the two genres had really kind of come to be understood in racially segregated terms by the early to mid-1980s, that Black artists had been sort of relegated both commercially and to a certain extent by audiences into the confines of producing R&B music or disco music. And this in sort of fairly flagrant contradistinction to the actual history of the development of rock and roll, both as a music that was borrowed heavily from blues and R&B stylings, particularly out of the South and the urban Midwest, but also just the actual history of 1960s and 1970s rock and roll features some of the most important characters are African-American characters: Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Wonder, Sly and the Family Stone. But what had happened by the late 1970s and early 1980s is there had been this kind of backlash against, in a lot of ways, it's a backlash against the politics of integration, the politics of multiracial democracy, and it spills out into the genre or into the arena of popular music in this kind of segregation between so-called black music forms and white music forms. And rock and roll had really become understood as being a preserve of white masculinity. And disco and R&B understood both as a space for black creation, but especially a space of feminine creation. And part of that has to do with the differences between pre-recorded music and sort of studio manipulation of music, which again that's not a disco thing. I mean, the Beatles are the first to really use the studio as its own instrument. The difference between that and the notion that rock and roll had a kind of authenticity or a kind of lived-inness, that it was bands of people who were creating and playing instruments in the moment, and that when you went to enjoy that music in a communal setting, you were going to experience the playing of live music rather than going to a dance club and listening to a DJ spin whatever the big disco or R&B hits of the day were. And Prince becomes, as Hamilton has it, and I think he's right on this, Prince becomes this kind of unusual figure within this space, because here's a guy who's a virtuoso musician who essentially played all of the instruments at a virtuistic level: guitar, bass, drums, keyboards, that you would ever find in a rock and roll band. But he had in his first several albums, they were almost all self-recorded, self-produced. He made them all. And there was this tendency to kind of associate, both because of his race and because of his musical virtuosity, to contain him or cabin him within this category of R&B and disco. And what Purple Rain makes clear, right, and what the heavy spotlighting on the revolution as his band makes clear, is that this is a guy who is a rock musician. He's a rock star, and he's going to do the same kinds of Guitar Hero stuff that more conventional and well-known guitar heroes of the time, like Eddie Van Halen, were doing. And so it's a very self-conscious move, right? And it has both racial and gender overtones that Prince is making, that in order to move into the widest commercial, mainstream, and popular appeal, he's choosing a genre and he's choosing a method of musical expression that would have been unfamiliar or unconventional for the kind of person that he was.
Yeah, I think that very much kind of gets to the core of it. I thought I would just read this quote from the Jack Hamilton article. By combining two previously established filmic genres, the narrative rock and roll film and the concert film, Purple Rain helped shift the imaginative association of Prince's musical genre, turning him from an R&B prodigy to a rock icon. And even further, the Hamilton goes on to say, the triumph is one of artistic authenticity as specifically imagined by rock ideology, right? It's not a triumph of commercialism. It's not a triumph of getting people into the dance hall to sing along to the disco song. It's a triumph of his expression, his self-expression as a rock star. And it's kind of, as you said, like lived embodiment in an in the moment connection with a live audience, all of which just signifies of rock rather than necessarily disco.
Exactly. And I think it's meaningful here that this is a moment that he would reprise very famously in the Super Bowl performance in Miami.
I just watched that this morning. You told me the 2007 thing. Absolutely incredible.
Extraordinary performance. And it is a full-on band performance in front of an audience. And again, very heavy reliance upon the electric guitar.
Yeah, absolutely. In a context of essentially being submerged in a tsunami. So you're like, this sounds amazing. Why isn't he dead? Were the two kind of reactions I had.
Yeah, and so you can see at these sort of flashpoint moments in his career where he is seeking to appeal to the widest possible audience, he is choosing, arguably the widest, the music and the instrumentation that has the widest possible appeal.
Yeah, and that is elemental, and I mean that literally. In that, we talked about there's the famous anecdote that the producer of the halftime show said to Prince, like, "It's really raining hard. Are you sure you want to do this?" And Prince is like, "Can you make it rain harder?" And then there's the greatest moment of that performance, I think, is in Purple Rain, and the stage goes purple, and of course it is raining, and he seems to take in the conditions like, "It's all right.
Yeah,
it's okay.
Yeah."
All right, we should wrap up this section, and we will be right back with our final section on critique. And we are back with our consideration of Purple Rain on its 40th birthday. And this is our final section. It's called Critique. We do several things in critique. Well, we do what we want, really. It's just the kind of guys we are. But some of the things we have characteristically done in the section on critique is think about, is this text, whatever it is, offering a kind of a criticism of the accepted way of doing things. We also talk about the critical impact of a text. And I think you wanted to start, Jeff, with some critics of Prince, what he does, what he says, some of his songs, some of the controversy that he had occasioned in his life.
So by and large, the movie was received well.
Yeah.
It famously received 2 thumbs up from Siskel and Ebert, the famous American movie reviewers. But Siskel and Ebert were broadly consistent with other movie critics as well, which is that they were less interested in the story elements and the acting and dialogue, and just sort of blown away by the concert performances. And by and large, that was how there was a kind of a rapturous reception for the music itself. But not everyone, as you alluded to, was as besotted with Purple Rain as people like Ebert and Siskel were. Very famously or infamously, perhaps, Tipper Gore, who was the wife of Al Gore, who would later go on who was then Senator of Tennessee, would later go on to be vice president with Bill Clinton. She was a prominent member of the Parents Music Research Council, the PMRC, and this was a council that was it was very 1980s in its way, very 70s and 80s. It was a concerned council of people who were sort of pop culture watchdogs or lookouts, searching for themes and ideas that they considered to be dangerously subversive that would send kids in the wrong direction, I suppose. So they were really exorcised by sex, but also they would occasionally get themselves upset about things like portrayals of violence or Satanism in popular music. And famously, they came up with a list of 15 songs, which they referred to as the Filthy 15, which they considered to be, verboten, things that should not be listened to by any good-minded, God-fearing young family. And funnily enough, 3 of the top 4 songs on the Filthy 15 were written by Prince. And number 1 was Darling Nikki, which plays a prominent role in Purple Rain, the movie.
Right. Well, and I heard an extension of that story, which was that Tipper Gore had bought Purple Rain, the album, for Alan Tipper's daughter. And then, who knows if it's apocryphal, and then kind of walks past the bedroom door when Darling Nikki's playing. She's like, wait a second. And this was the genesis of
begins.
Yeah, of the and the upshot of this, as I understand it, was the label parental advisory explicit lyrics stamped on the front of when people used to buy CDs, that kind of black and white label. There was a mark that really this was a CD you should buy. You should give extra special consideration. Certainly when I was younger. Which I don't think was quite the
not the intention.
Yeah, not the intention. So that's Tipper Gore's view on Purple Rain. What do you make of what Sean Burns from WBUR said about Purple Rain, the movie? He said, it's, quote, a truly bizarre movie, at once atrocious and awesome, featuring musical performances so sublime you instantly forgive that the rest is so ridiculous. The quality gulf between onstage exhilaration and backstage soap opera here is roughly the size of Mother Russia.
I think I agree in full.
Well, one thumb up and one thumb way down, really.
Yeah.
Totally bizarre. So my hot critical take here, Jeff, is that the movie is bizarre in ways that I think Prince is in control of and are quite deliberate.
Okay.
And I think, although I do have a tendency to this kind of weird critical conspiracy theorizing, so tell me if I go way off the rails. But my theory of this whole textual universe is this is an album and a movie that begin in exactly the same way, like Ladies and Gentlemen, The Revolution, right? Which is like a nice name for a band, but you are explicitly promising something we would talk about and critique all the time: a revolution in conventional thinking and ways of living. So that's your opening salvo. Yeah. There's then a funeral oration, it sounds like, with church organs playing in the background, where, we're gathered here to talk about life, an electric word. It's forever. It's a mighty long time. But there's something, and here I'm going to lose my ability to directly quote, but there's something
more,
something beyond this, in a very different world that awaits you.
Yeah.
Afterlife. And I think that world, what we're being transported in Purple Rain, and maybe in the album as well, is a sort of a netherworld or another world, an alternate reality that is a more rewarding, more accepting, more fluid, more interesting, more authentic place than the real world. Yeah. And it's a world where things that Sean Burns of WBUR could call, truly atrocious and ridiculous, actually make perfect kind of sense within within Prince's utopic world, right? Where everyone is purified in the waters of Lake Minnetonka. There's him and Garrison Keillor, right, who hold this view of Minnesota. And everyone who Minnesota is where everything happens. It's the happening scene. It's the center of the artistic and cultural universe. And everyone who is there is a post-commercial being who doesn't really care about money. They just care about artistic self-expression, where men and women kind of look the same and sort of act the same. And this is again drawing upon that Jack Hamilton article, if you go back and you watch the crowd in the club, it's a sort of effortlessly multiracial crowd, and there's no hint that why would it be anything other than. It's a world of people that dress in highly heterogeneous, gender fluid and sort of subcultural fluid kind of ways. and they come together for ecstatic communal experiences. And this is life, and it sounds pretty good to me, Jeff.
Yeah, I think that's very astute. And a couple of things come to mind. First of all, Minnesota is presented as God's country, really, because as we talked about earlier, almost the entire movie was shot in Minneapolis on scene. But some of the most interesting, I say maybe the most successful of the scenes that are not concert scenes are the ones that take place kind of in this pastoral Minnesota environment, right? Open fields, lakes, very open spacey kind of things. Not very many people there. Prince kind of riding through, sometimes with Apollonia, sometimes not, on his bespoke purple motorcycle. And it's a very kind of pastures of plenty kind of thematic that articulates with this sort of, as you say, this kind of heavenly vision of the possibilities of life.
Yeah.
The other thing that comes to mind is so famously, Prince designed his outfits for the 1999 tour, which immediately preceded Purple Rain, but he then recycled some of those outfits in Purple Rain themselves. And the most iconic of which, actually the one that's on one of the ones that's on your shirt, was explicitly modeled. He explicitly modeled it after the replicant outfits in the movie Blade Runner, and Roy Batty's outfits in particular. Now, Blade Runner, I know, is a text that's dear to your heart.
Yeah.
But of course, that text is all about the literal blurring of boundaries between humanity and non-humanity. It is itself a depiction of a sort of afterlife. It's nightmarish, rather than heavenly. But it's clear that these are. It's impossible to understand entirely what's going on in Prince's mind, because it's just a kind of inscrutability, as we've talked about, I think, with both his music and with his personal presentation and vision of life. But it certainly seems like there's some attempt to offer up this kind of utopic moment that revolves around creativity, that revolves around musicianship, that revolves around communal interaction and connection, in which the kind of contemporary or even long-standing historic conventional kinds of identities and stereotypes and boundaries they dissolve and they're unimportant, and they just don't exist anymore.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anything else we want to say in this section on critique?
I think we've given the viewers and our listeners so much.
A full-throated,
a full discussion,
a full discussion of the movie. I think we've covered the album as well, pretty well. I will say, okay, so let me give you one last hot take.
Yeah,
here's When Doves Cry. That's like the big one.
Yeah, that was the first single off that.
I think that album's so immediate, and timeless. I think a lot of it sounds like it could be from several different eras.
Yeah.
When Doves Cry sounds to me like it's from the Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack. It's so,
you're right,
1980s. It seems so pigeonholed to me that I'm surprised that's the one that's seen as the.
That's a good point, and it's worth noting that When Doves Cry was apparently the final song, I should say, that was written for the album.
Yeah.
And that it was specifically inspired by the director of the movie's suggestion to Prince that it would be nice if he had some kind of different song that they could do a montage over during the movie, which is how it appears in Purple Rain.
Right.
Rather than a concert performance, it's a montage. And so there's that. It feels a little out of place, probably because it was out of place. It was written at a different time than the rest of the songs were. But the other reason I suspect that it feels so out of place is it's very heavy on synth.
Yeah.
It's heavy on a drum machine.
Right.
Famously, Prince removed the bass line that he had played originally in the recording in order to emphasize the synth and drum machine elements of it, the kind of modern elements of it. But where it's totally in place is it begins, as we were talking about off camera, with this kind of extraordinary guitar riff that's 5 seconds long. And if you listen, the outro is a long guitar solo, electric guitar solo as well. So there are, I think, these musical elements of continuity between that song and the rest of the album.
Yeah.
But maybe that's what made it a perfect first single, right? Is that you didn't have the rest of the album yet to put into context what this single was doing.
Yes. Okay.
And if you note the placement of When Doves Cry on the album, it's right in the middle of the album.
Yes.
And it signifies a little bit of a kind of a shift thematically from the earlier songs. You say begins with Let's Go Crazy, which is this sort of, I mean, not very subtle, right, kind of homage to sort of Christian rebirth. Then we get the sex songs. Most infamously Darling Nikki. And then the second half of the album is really quite different, right? It moves, When Doves Cry is this kind of story of family trauma and difficult interpersonal relations. And then it moves into I Would Die For You and Baby I'm a Star. And then finally Purple Rain, which is, as in the movie, right, marks the moment of transcendence.
Yeah.
So I think there are continuities there, but I think you're right to detect some out-of-placedness with When Doves Cry, and I suspect it is process-based rather than creative.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough.
So let's finish with this. So, this is not the first of these music pods that we have done. We
No.
famously talked both about Taylor Swift.
I don't know how famous it is, but I do remember doing
famous in my mind.
Arctic Monkeys we did.
Yeah.
So well, Taylor Swift was when you were talking about someone who, and I think you did it knowingly. You said you could even say these were eras.
Yeah.
Talk about an artist who was so prolific in their creativity, was capable of moving across genres. I think Prince had a wider range than Taylor Swift, but nonetheless, she has an unusually wide range.
Yeah.
And someone who fell out with their record company. There's an obvious comparison there.
There is.
Yeah. But where were you going with that?
Well,
anyway.
I was going to ask you. So I don't always know how you'll respond, and part of the fun of doing these for me is that you should get to see how somebody who doesn't have any experience with this music or with these artists responds and reacts. My sense from our conversation, we've not talked really much about this at all in advance of recording. My sense is that you like Prince.
Yeah. I think he's.
But you
like is a strong word. It takes a lot of listens for you to truly kind of own, for me anyway, to truly own something and truly get into it. But I'm intrigued enough to keep listening, which is how all things that you like begin in that way. And I find him a confusing and perplexing enough figure, both in the musical presentation and the persona. Again, to find it really, really interesting. I'm totally blown away by as I think everyone is, and it's the oldest thing you could say about Prince, just the craftsmanship and the virtuosity. Like
He's also a great singer, which we have
a incredible singer, huge range. Yeah. And all the songs, just when you think like this is getting a bit too commercial to me, or it's a bit lightweight or whatever, there's a punch to it, or an unexpected thing that you're like, all right, this is, and Don Draper said something once on Mad Men. I'll pull this back to Peggy Olson, where she said, "I've got this idea, and it's I can't tell whether it's total genius or it's absolutely ridiculous, or whether it's sublime or ridiculous." And he says, "They're very, very close." And I think that's always true. That right, all genius exists right on that line, and just an inch the other way, and it's absolutely ridiculous. And that's where I am with Prince. Every time I'm like, I think this is ridiculous. I can't listen to another song where someone goes, "Baby, baby, baby, baby," and this is just so commercial and boring and all that. And then there's something like super interesting, and you're like, oh, he is perfectly in control of this. Yeah. And those kind of universal sentiments expressed in an original way, musically and lyrically, are of course where all the action is, and it's always going to be on that borderline of sublime and ridiculous. And he I think is a candidate for existing in that space, which is a space that for me very few artists kind of occupy.
Yeah.
So that's where I come out.
Yeah.
All right, good stuff. Okay. So there was some extra bonus hot takes at the end there.
That's what people come to us for.
Always remember, these pods are worth what you pay for them. To rip off Matthew Iglesias from Twitter. Anyway, I think it's pastime when we say good night and good luck and goodbye. And on that bombshell,